Hi, everyone. I'm Tony Williams with the Bill of Rights Institute, and we are here with another Scholar Talks for Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. It's our great privilege to have one of the authors of an earlier essay from the textbook, Native People, by Andrew Fisher. Now, Andrew Fisher is an associate professor of history and the director of the Environmental Science and Policy program at the College of William and Mary, which is right down the road from me. And he received his PhD from Arizona State in 2003 and focuses on Native American history, environmental history, and the American West. His first book was Shadow Tribe, The Making of Columbia River Indian Identity. His current project is a biography of Yakima actor and activist Nippo Strongheart. Andrew, welcome very much, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great, and thank you for your contribution to the project. We've had over 100 scholars, and you made some great contributions, so we really appreciate it.
Yeah, I was happy to see it in print. It looks beautiful. Not in print, but online.
Right. And it is free, available free online. Just a great resource, especially with a lot of schools and students going online. I think it'll be a fabulous resource now and into the future. But if you're ready to dive in, I am. And so why don't we get started?
Sure.
So I was wondering if you could provide us with maybe a general overview of life in North America for Native Americans before the Europeans arrived in 1492.
Sure, I'll try. It's difficult to generalize about Native life in North America before European colonization began because indigenous cultures continually evolved over time, as all cultures do, and they varied widely even within particular culture areas. The ancestors of Native Americans arrived in what is now the United States at least 12,000 years ago, and new evidence and techniques like ancient DNA testing strongly suggest that people came much earlier than previously thought, and probably by multiple routes other than the so-called Bering Land Bridge. And that theory it's not been completely blown out of the water, but it has been complicated by competing theories about where Native peoples came from and when. There have even been radiocarbon dates produced at sites like Monteverde in Chile, which is way down at the tip of South America, that range from 14,500 years ago to more than 30,000 years ago. And although those older dates especially are contested within the archaeological community, they really beg the question, even 14,500 years ago, really begs the question of how people got there, since ice-free corridors didn't open up in northern North America until much later. Regardless of which route they took, the Paleo-Indians, as they're often called, Stone Age Indians, who were the first arrivals, migrated to the Americas thousands and thousands of years before Europeans, and they had a lot of time to disperse and diversify. And so really the New World was a very old world by the time Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And by the time Columbus showed up, Native North Americans spoke about 500 distinct languages and dialects, which gives you a very rough idea of how many different tribes or nations there were. That diversity and dynamism are probably the most important things to remember about pre-Columbian Native America. Thanks especially to Western movies and television, we have this false impression that all American Indians were teepee dwelling, buffalo hunting, feathered headdress wearing plains warriors, the Tonka for you Dances with Wolves fans. But not all Native Americans were or are like that. And even Plains Indians weren't really like that until Europeans reintroduced horses to North America. The cultures that Europeans first encountered didn't exist in some sort of timeless, unchanging, and uniform world. They were peoples who had been evolving over thousands of years. Another point to remember is that these cultures were interconnected. They communicated and traded with each other through vast networks that linked different culture areas and parts of the continent. At places like the Dalles on the mid-Columbia River, which is within the homeland of the Yakimas and a number of other tribes, people and goods from many different places mingled in a great marketplace that we can see vestiges of in the archaeological record. There are sites there that were flooded by the construction of dams in the mid-20th century. And before the waters rose, archaeologists dug into things like the middens, basically the trash heaps that native people had left. And in the lowest layers, there were archaeological remains, things like fish bones and so on, that were more than 10,000 years old. And then the upper layers were trade goods that had been brought by European and American sea captains visiting the coast, and then by Lewis and Clark in the early 19th century. So it just gives you a sense of the depth of the length of human occupation in that region. And you find things in these middens that aren't indigenous or native to the Northwest. And that tells you that, there are these trade networks that are stretching all the way across the continent. Local foodstuffs like salmon and camas roots could be exchanged at the Dalles for more exotic things like buffalo robes and other products from the plains, or dentalia shells, which are only found on the Northwest coast off Vancouver Island. And they were very prized for decoration, and they even became a kind of currency like wampum did in the East. Different groups also came there to exchange information, captives, and marriage partners in order to solidify economic and diplomatic alliances with each other. And again, you see goods from all over the continent in the archaeological mix. So it's not necessarily that people came all the way from the plains, but that goods changed hands multiple times and then made their way, oftentimes thousands of miles from the interior to the coast, or the other way around, from the coast to the interior. So the point is that the pre-Columbian native people weren't isolated from each other or stagnant culturally before Europeans arrived. They weren't simply sitting around waiting for whites to show up so that history could begin. Finally, I think it's really important to remember that native peoples were actively using and even modifying the landscape, contrary to the virgin land myth that Europeans and later Americans used to justify conquering and colonizing indigenous territories. Centuries before whites arrived, maize-based agriculture had spread north from Mexico and taken hold in places as diverse as the New Mexican pueblos, the upper Missouri River villages of the Mandans, and in many places in the eastern woodlands where English colonists first arrived, like at Jamestown, just down the road from here, where they traded for corn. And then when the Indians wouldn't trade for corn, the English took it because they needed it to survive. So maize-based agriculture and other crops like beans and squash, the so-called Three Sisters, they sustained life in the eastern woodlands and in many other parts of North America. And the first European explorers who came to places like Virginia were amazed by the bounty of Indian fields, and also by the fact that Indian women often did most of the farming and controlled the crops. So they had different sort of gender norms and different gender roles, which to Europeans look kind of backwards. Another point is that even where American Indians hadn't developed agriculture, they actively shaped the landscape, especially through the use of fire to drive game, to remove undergrowth for hunting, and to create grazing areas that were attractive to deer and elk. They also used fire to encourage the growth of useful plants, to clear forest for farming, or to propitiate, propagate berries and roots that they used to survive. So although we sometimes use the term nomads to describe groups that lived by hunting, fishing, and gathering. They didn't wander aimlessly across the landscape hoping to find enough food to survive, which is a great recipe for starvation. They moved in predictable patterns across territories that they knew extremely well because they had lived there for centuries or even millennia. And so while it may not be accurate to call them ecologists, because their knowledge of nature wasn't constituted in the way Western science has done, they had a very deep knowledge, a very deep working knowledge of how particular environments worked.
Well, I know you're just scratching the surface on that, but I know a really rich tapestry of just sort of generalizations and some really fascinating things. And that's what you do in your essay. I think you break down the native peoples by regions and paint that picture of a rich and very diverse different cultures, economic systems, adaptations to the environment, shaping the environment, all fascinating. And so maybe we just talk about some of those particular Indian tribes or nations that you talk about in your essay.
Sure.
Specifically, why don't we start with the coastal living and fishing lifestyles that help shape the lives and culture of the Northwest coast native peoples.
Yeah, I'm happy to start there because that's my homeland, so to speak. I'm from Portland. I miss the Northwest dearly, which is part of why I chose it as a research field. So I'm happy to start there. I often tell students, that the Northwest is the region I know best, and it's also the best region. So the really interesting thing about Northwest Coast peoples, from Oregon up through what is now Washington State and into British Columbia, all the way up to southeastern Alaska, is that they lived in such a rich environment in terms of resources, from marine mammals to salmon to deer and elk to many different varieties of roots and berries, that they were able to develop semi-sedentary, stationary societies with social stratification or classes without developing agriculture, which anthropologically is the way social stratification is usually explained. That you have people who grow enough food that there are other people in the society who don't have to devote themselves to procuring food, and you have the development of different professions, and you also have the ability to amass wealth and sometimes even control the labor and lives of others through slavery. By and large, at the time of European contact, you didn't have a lot of societies like this in North America. Most of them were hunting, fishing, and gathering, or they were horticultural societies. And in the Northwest, you have socially stratified societies, particularly north of the Columbia River and especially up into what is now Canada, groups like the Kwakiutl or Kwakwaka'wakwa and various Coast Salish groups. They had developed a system where you had what we might call noble families. You had commoners below them, and then you had people who were held as slaves, generally captives taken in war from other groups. And this is not, it's important to say, a racialized or chattel system of slavery like developed in the Caribbean or the American South after European colonization. These systems of unfree bondage they varied across cultures. Sometimes people were able to become free and even marry into the group, but you had a hierarchical society in the absence of agriculture, and also people who could live quite well without having to grow food. So on the Northwest Coast, you have, as a way of demonstrating wealth, this ceremony called the potlatch, which is still done in places like British Columbia, where wealthy, noble families would host elaborate feasts. And they would often work very hard for months or even years to accumulate the property that would then be lavishly given away, and the food that would be served at these potlatches. And this was a way not only of redistributing wealth within the group, particularly during the winter months when food was often scarce. It was a way of incurring obligations, debts that then people would have to pay back. It was even a way of shaming enemies. So sometimes you would invite your enemies to your potlatch, basically to show them up and say, hey, if you can't put on a better party than this, then we're better than you, aren't we? I often explain it to students as, the reason why your parents will invite people they actually don't like to your wedding. It's just to show them, how wealthy you are and what a good party you can put on. So potlatches were one expression of this class system that existed in the Northwest, as well as slavery. Over the mountains in eastern Oregon and Washington, east of the Cascades, on the Columbia Plateau, which is where I really have focused my research, you have more egalitarian societies that are based on hunting, fishing, and gathering. But as elsewhere, they're moving regularly through territory that they consider themselves to belong to, even more than it belongs to them. They believe they belong to these landscapes. And through hunting, fishing, and gathering, they're able to live ordered, predictable lives in their homelands.
Right. Yeah, really fascinating. Moving geographical regions, the geography of California is extremely varied and seems to have led to a vibrant diversity of peoples and cultures as well. I was wondering if you can describe them.
Sure. There are too many to really go into great detail about, but California was, like it is today, one of the most densely populated and diverse parts of North America. Estimates vary, and estimating population is a tricky business given the records we have. But at the time of first contact with the Spanish in 1542, there were probably about 300,000 native people in California, just west of the Sierras. And that was the most densely populated part because it's the most resource rich. So in the coastal areas and the river valleys west of the Sierras, you had probably about 300,000 people, and they spoke as many as 100 different languages. Culturally, they were all similar in the sense that they were hunting, fishing, and gathering peoples. They weren't agricultural cultures. But even so, they were able to make a good living from the landscape, especially California's oak woodlands provided a very rich source of food in the form of acorns. And I think I mentioned in the essay that perhaps 600,000 tons of acorns were harvested annually. In Northern California, up towards what is now the Oregon border, groups like the Caruks and the Yurok and the Hoopas also fished for salmon in rivers like the Klamath. They foraged for plants and hunted game in the vast forests along the coast as well. So they had some similarities with people to the north, along the northwest coast. In the Sierras and east of the mountains, people had to be more creative in terms of procuring food because there weren't as many resources, particularly in the dry eastern part of California. And so they developed strategies and knowledge of nature that are really quite impressive by present standards. For example, California Indians in the Sierras would prune mountain plants and thereby influence the size and composition of forests. They also use fire to do this. In valleys like Yosemite, the Awenich people would cut the ends off the branches of oak trees to enhance acorn production the following year, because they knew that if you did that, you'd get a more bountiful crop Mono Indian women on the eastern side of the Sierras would also cut specific elderberry bushes down to ground level, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but they knew that it would actually make them grow faster and increase the production of berries. And they sometimes even transplanted productive plants nearer to trails for easier access, because they don't want to have to walk as far into the mountains either to get these foods. So they were intelligent users and even manipulators of the landscape. Finally, one more example. In Southern California, near what is now Los Angeles and San Diego, the Chumash people harvested resources both from land and sea with great efficiency and with some pretty impressive technology. The closer a village was to the ocean, generally speaking, the greater its reliance on maritime or ocean resources. And with advanced canoe designs, very seaworthy and sturdy canoes, coastal and island peoples could catch fish quite far out in the Pacific, even huge swordfish. I am not a fisherman, despite my name, Fisher. That was somewhere way back in my family tree. But if you know anything about sports fishing, swordfish are among the most prized trophy fish, and they are fighters. They are big fish. They are not easy to land, even with modern rods and plastic monofilament lines. Chumash people could bring these swordfish in using harpoons and fishing line that they made. There's the dog knocking something over. So they lived quite well off the bounty of the sea, including things like seals and sea otters, which they would then trade with interior groups for products that they couldn't procure in their own homeland. And this is common throughout North America, that what you can't produce yourself in your own territory, you can often get through trade with other groups.
Right. Wow. Well, switching climates probably to the Great Basin in the West, which was a lot harsher than what you just described in California. How did that necessitate several new innovations for survival?
Well, the Great Basin, places like Utah and Nevada and much of Idaho are very dry. They have very few rivers. The lakes that are there are often saline, like the Great Salt Lake. So to survive in the Great Basin requires a lot of ingenuity and also a lot of mobility. There were some areas like Pyramid Lake in western Nevada where you had abundant populations of fish, which are called kiwi by the Pyramid Lake Paiutes. Also at Utah Lake, south of modern day Salt Lake City near Provo, you had enough fish and reliable sources of fresh water and other foods that enabled people to remain more sedentary and live in larger communities. The same is true of Ute territory in western Colorado. So people don't have to move around quite so much necessarily to survive. But in much of the Great Basin, you had to be mobile, and population sizes were smaller. People tended to travel in family groups or maybe extended family groups, a few households, rather than what we think of as big tribes. And they would move regularly between food caches and water sources. They knew when particular things like nut crops or roots would be ripe. And so they knew where to go when. So again, they're not just wandering aimlessly around the desert, but they're moving purposefully from place to place within what they understand to be their territory. Even in the Great Basin, though, there are people who learn to manipulate the environment to make it more productive. For example, Paiutes, Southern Paiutes in the Owens Valley on the eastern side of the Sierra would dig irrigation ditches to encourage the growth of edible bulbs like locust. And in Ute territory, people also learned how to do some of the things I've talked about with California Indians, like pruning trees and bushes in order to encourage their growth. For most groups, though, in the Great Basin, as I've said, survival required mobility. And so the genius really is knowing how to plan your movements across a very hostile landscape so that you always have access to water and food.
Right. Okay. Good. And many viewers are probably familiar with the Plains Indians, or at least with our stereotypes of them. And so, what was their relationship to the land, and especially these great buffalo herds before the Europeans arrived? And maybe if you can just briefly give us some sense of maybe how that changed later.
Yeah. Of course, Plains Indians are Native Americans, par excellence in the European and American imagination, in large part because of the powerful equestrian tribes, the horse cultures that flourished there from the late 18th through the late 19th century. These are groups like the Lakotas, the Cheyennes, and on the southern plains, the Comanches, who were real powers to be reckoned with, and caused the United States and earlier European traders and Spanish missionaries and other earlier European groups in the region, caused them a lot of trouble. But it's important to remember they didn't have horses until Europeans reintroduced them. There were, we know from the fossil record, little horses that had died out about 10,000 years ago, around the end of the last ice age. And we can see them in the fossil record. But the big horses that you can ride were reintroduced by the Spanish and other European powers. And then by the end of the 17th century, native peoples in the Southwest and then on the plains were acquiring them through capture or trade with each other. And then some peoples actually became accomplished horse breeders in their own right. So horses will dramatically revolutionize not only buffalo hunting, but life on the plains generally. And a lot of plains oral traditions, like there's a story among the Cheyennes about Maheo, basically the creator, telling them, I can give you horses, and horses will in many ways make your life easier. You will be able to travel farther, you'll be able to travel faster, you'll be able to carry heavier loads, but know also that it will change your life in negative ways. You will always have to be moving to find adequate pasture. Your enemies will come to steal your horses, and you make a choice about what you want to do. So horses revolutionize native life on the plains in the same way the car revolutionizes American life in the early 20th century, or a smartphone. We can't imagine, I'm sure students in high school can't imagine living without these things now. The same is true of the horse. By the late 19th century, a lot of native oral traditions spoke of the horse as if they had always had it, because they couldn't conceive of life without it. But for centuries before horses were introduced, native people hunted buffalo on foot, sometimes by disguising themselves with skins as other animals so they could creep close enough to shoot them with arrows, or by stampeding them over buffalo jumps, like head smashed in, which is, I think the picture is featured in the textbook, a cliff in Alberta, where using sometimes fire or large groups of people to corral the animals, they would stampede them over the cliff and they would fall and smash their heads in, and then you could butcher them at the bottom of the cliff. They also built stone pounds or surrounds where you would, again, through coordinated movement and using sometimes dogs, which was the only domestic animal native people had, you would get them to run into a pound where they couldn't escape, and then you could slaughter them there. So it took quite a bit of ingenuity and planning to hunt buffalo before horses arrived. One quick story that I think is kind of funny, although it comes from the Columbia Plateau rather than the plains, is the story of how horses in the Yakima language acquired the name that used to belong to dogs. A lot of native people in North America had dogs, and on the plains they would use them before they had horses to carry loads and to pull travois. You know, these, you put a couple teepee poles together and then you tie them at one end, and you could pile stuff in there and the dogs would pull them. Horses, of course, can carry much heavier loads and move a lot faster than dogs. So in the Yakima language, dogs actually got demoted. The word for dog used to be kusi, Kusi, kusi. And when horses came along and the Yakima people adopted them, they applied the word kusi to the horse. And so what had been dog became horse. And dogs became kusi, which is a diminutive form, which basically means little horse. So just again shows you how horses revolutionize native society in many places and become integral to their culture. They become the primary form of wealth that people have, and also the primary, for Plains men, they become the primary path to manhood through hunting and war and raiding. One other thing that I'll mention about the Plains is that there are agricultural people or horticultural societies on the Plains. Some tribes, such as the Mandans on the Upper Missouri and the Pawnees along the Platte in what's now Nebraska, had adopted maize and other crops, and they grew enough food that way to enable them to be more sedentary. They lived in stable, you know, more or less permanent earth lodge villages and not migratory teepee camps. And although they also hunted buffalo, they oftentimes traded their crops for bison meat and robes that were procured by more nomadic groups. And significantly, in these semi-agrarian societies, women, like was true east of the Mississippi, tended the fields and controlled the produce, which gave them economic and social power that European women at the time generally did not have in their households.
Right. Well, I think my dogs are happy they get to sleep all day rather than
Exactly.
loads all over the plains. So.
Yeah, we don't have to drag loads around for us anymore.
Right, good. Okay, and then the Southwest region, they witnessed the thriving Pueblo cultures until some prolonged droughts, as you write, invited some long-term competition from other tribes. And can you describe that process? And I think maybe you want to talk a little bit about some of the ancient peoples. And
Yes, I didn't talk very much about them in the essay because I didn't have the space. But in the Southwest, centuries before Europeans arrived in the region, you had flourishing civilizations like the Hohokam along the Salt and Gila rivers in central and southern Arizona, and to the north in what is now the Four Corners region of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. You had the ancestral Puebloans, or they used to be called the Anasazi, which is actually a Navajo or Dene word that modern Pueblos don't like because it means ancient enemy. But the ancestral Puebloans built at places like Chaco Canyon in northern New Mexico impressive urban complexes like Pueblo Bonito, which the Spanish named, beautiful town. And they practiced agriculture using both the limited rainfall and irrigation in order to support larger populations than this desert environment could normally sustain. The same was true of the Hohokam. They built canals that actually the Phoenix water system still uses the original beds to move water around the city. So these people were skilled engineers. We know that they studied the stars. They practiced a kind of astronomy that was especially important for agricultural people to know, when the rains would come, and so forth. They, in the case of the ancestral Puebloans, they built what have often described as the first modern apartment complexes in North America. In places like Chaco Canyon, they built multi-story stone buildings that housed thousands of people. They built roads. And remember, they don't have domestic animals. They don't have cattle or horses. They don't have wheeled transport, but they built perfectly straight roads radiating out from Chaco Canyon and connecting that place to smaller towns and villages around them. And archaeologists today aren't even sure exactly why. Were they trade routes? Were they pilgrimage routes? Were they both? Pueblo Bonito may have been a religious center. So they built these roads, and they even cut steps into cliff faces so they wouldn't have to go around them. And they built causeways, and these are roads that are still visible from the air in much of the Southwest. And they're not as extensive or as grand as the roads that Romans built, but presumably they had similar kind of function, which just symbolized the power of the Anasazi, or the ancestral Puebloan elites. But then, as you said, it was undone by drought. The Southwest is an arid or semi-arid region. And when drought strikes, and we're currently in a very severe drought that's been going on almost 20 years, their crops withered, and that appears to have brought on increased unrest and war among peoples in the region. And they begin building their settlements into things like cliff faces, like at Monteverde, where they're obviously trying to protect themselves. If you go to Monteverde, you can see that it's built high on a cliff, and you can only access many of the rooms with ladders. So people don't build homes like that unless they're worried about someone coming and taking their stuff and maybe killing them. So it shows you that native North America was not an Eden, as it's often described, a place of complete peace and harmony. But the advanced civilization of the ancestral Puebloans shows you that it also wasn't the world of utter darkness and savagery and primitivism that Europeans often described when they arrived. But this civilization had fallen apart by the time the Europeans actually laid eyes on it. And one of the things that's kind of amusing is that they were at a loss to explain it, because they assumed that the local natives that they met couldn't have been responsible for it. So they oftentimes came up with outlandish theories about where these things had come from. Well, maybe the Aztecs had come north and built these, or maybe a Roman galley got blown off course, and some Romans wandered out here. But the so-called mystery of the Anasazi has pretty much been solved by archaeologists, and the answer is not that they disappeared, but rather that they migrated. They migrated south and east and became the Hopis, the Zunis, and the various pueblos of northern New Mexico that Europeans encountered. And in many ways, they reconstituted the society that existed in places like Pueblo Bonito, but they did it on a smaller, more sustainable scale by practicing agriculture in irrigated fields and developing elaborate kachina dances that propitiate the spirits, the kachinas that bring rain from the mountains.
Yeah, and I know that you're going to, by necessity, paint some broad strokes here, but the Native Americans east of the Mississippi, now they built some complex political systems and diplomatic alliances, cultures. And how did those rivalries shape the course of history in that region before the Europeans came, but then obviously shaped how they interacted with the Europeans when they did come. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that.
Right. Yeah. East of the Mississippi, you also see in the pre-contact or pre-Columbian period, great civilizations like the Adena Hopewell cultural complex, which flourished in Ohio and Indiana and left behind elaborate mounds like the Great Serpent Mound near Chillicothe, which is quite a sight to see. I haven't seen it yet, but if you view it from the air, it looks like a snake eating an egg, and it's quite large. And so the mystery of it is, how did people who didn't have access to airplanes or satellites or drones, how did they plan this thing out and actually build it? And in a lot of these mounds, archaeologists have discovered evidence of vast wealth. So these were also socially stratified hierarchical societies that were connected to each other and to other places through vast trade networks that brought things like precious metals that could then be made into works of art that were buried with the important people, like the Egyptians did, for example. Even more impressive in terms of its size was the Mississippian culture complex, which produced one of the great urban centers in North America, which is called Cahokia. It's across the river from modern day St. Louis. And although the pyramids there have been worn down by erosion and some of them were destroyed by development, archaeologists who've studied that place have concluded that at its base, the Great Central Pyramid in Cahokia, which was a palisaded city with walls around it, was larger than the Great Pyramid at Giza. So these are enormous structures that towered over a city that at its peak, about 1,000 years ago, scholars estimate, may have housed as many as 250,000 people, which would make it as large as London at the time, which was the largest city in medieval Europe. So it's a big urban center. And we also know that these people, like the ancestral Puebloans, practiced astronomy. They studied the movement of the heavens. They were also an agricultural society that produced large surpluses of food that could sustain, the upper classes and also provide trade. And then, although the reasons are still a little bit murky, it seems that climate change associated with the Little Ice Age caused drought or floods or things that undermined the economic base of the society, and it disintegrated, and the people spread out, and some of them became other mound building societies that the Spanish encountered when they came into the Southeast. But again, the civilization that they left behind was so inexplicable to Europeans that they grasped at straws to explain how it had come about, because they assumed that native people were incapable of building on that kind of scale. To get back to your question, by the time Europeans arrived on the eastern seaboard, some powerful confederacies had formed in places like Virginia. The Powhatan Confederacy confronted John Smith and the English. The Powhatans had, through trade and diplomacy, but also through conquest, cobbled together a network of different tribes that stretched all the way from, the peninsula here in southeastern Virginia up to around modern day Washington, D.C., and as far west as the Blue Ridge. Even more powerful was the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee people of upstate New York, the so-called 5 nations, ultimately became 6 nations after the Tuscaroras joined them in the colonial era. But the Mohawks, the Senecas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Tuscaroras and the Oneidas set aside their internal differences. And there's a great oral tradition associated with this. The work of Hiawatha and Daganoweda helped to put aside their differences and form a unified confederacy. It has been argued, although it's a very contentious debate, that the Iroquois Confederacy provided the blueprint for the United States, that people like Benjamin Franklin admired the work that they had done in forming a federal system. In effect, you have 5 or 6 different nations that are independent, but then they also they're like states. But then, in terms of dealing with foreign threats, or what we might call international diplomacy, they tried to act as one. So they are a very powerful force in the Northeast at the time, and through the covenant chain, which was a metaphor, they extended the chain of peace and friendship that united their own confederacy to other groups. And in fact, that was often done through conquest, but groups like the Delawares and the Shawnees sometimes joined the covenant chain. And then later the Dutch and the English take hold of this chain. And this native metaphor, this native way of conducting diplomacy becomes very important in the Eastern Woodlands for Europeans if they want to get anything done, if they want to trade, if they want alliances. In particular, you have to appease or mollify the Iroquois.
Okay. Again, more broad strokes, but just as the final question here, as we wrap things up, how did the course of history for these native peoples change with the arrival and settlement of the Europeans in 1492 and then 1607 at Jamestown?
Yeah. Well, should be clear by now that, as I said at the beginning, the so-called New World that Europeans described wasn't really new because it had been settled by Native Americans for perhaps 20,000 years before Columbus showed up in the Caribbean. But the arrival of Europeans greatly accelerated the pace of change. And so North America quickly became what historian James Merrill has called a new world for all. It becomes new for Native peoples, often in ways that they later regret. The most rapid and consequential change that overtook Native Americans resulted from the introduction of old world diseases to which they had no previous exposure and therefore no immunity. Living in the age of COVID-19, which is why we're doing this on Zoom, we all now have a good idea of what can happen to a society when it is struck by a novel virus or bacteria that is poorly understood and can be quite deadly. Many of the imported diseases that infected American Indians were even bigger killers, much bigger killers than COVID-19, especially smallpox and influenza. In some places, these diseases raced inland far ahead of actual European exploration and settlement through the trade networks that I've described. And although estimates vary, there's good evidence that in some places they killed a third or more of the people they infected in what must have been terrifying epidemics. They're sometimes called virgin soil epidemics because when a pathogen finds a population with no immunity, it runs wild. And so in some places, like coastal Massachusetts, by the time the Puritans showed up, there were whole villages that were empty and full of bones. And being the religious, providentially minded people they were, Puritans concluded that Providence or God had cleared a path for his chosen people, but it was really disease. Smallpox is really what enabled Cortez to topple the Aztec Empire with only a small army. And it's what allowed the Puritans to establish a beachhead in New England. So as historian Francis Jennings has said, North America wasn't a virgin land when Europeans arrived, but much of it became widowed due to European pathogens. Another aspect of what Alfred Crosby has called the Columbian exchange, this biological encounter between old and new worlds, was the importation of plants and animals, which also transformed the lives of Native Americans in dramatic ways. We've already talked about the reintroduction of horses and how that revolutionizes life on the Great Plains and gives rise to the great horse cultures that Americans later confronted in their expansion across the continent. Similarly, after the Navajos or the Dene in the Southwest acquired sheep and goats from the Spanish, they so thoroughly integrated them into their culture, not only as a source of mutton and milk, but also wool, which they then wove using techniques they learned from the Hopis and the Pueblos. They became so thoroughly integrated into Dene culture that, like horses with other groups, their oral traditions describe them as sacred gifts from the holy people, not something that they acquired from the Spanish. There are negative consequences to the introduction, ecologically at least, though. When you talk about horses and sheep, they heavily affected the natural environments of the plains and the Southwest. The Navajo country, Dineta, is very dry with very little rainfall, thin soils, and not a lot of grass cover. And goats and sheep can have a significant impact on that environment. The same is true of plains, grasslands, where horses, larger and larger horse herds increasingly competed with native game, including bison, for forage. In colonial New England, the pigs that the English brought became a source of trouble because they would let their pigs wander, and native people didn't fence their fields, and the pigs would go into the native people's fields and eat their crops, and then the native people would often kill the pigs, and all of a sudden you've got like an international incident on your hands. This biological encounter has unpredictable consequences. Europeans get a lot out of it. They get corn, they get beans and squash, they get tomatoes and potatoes from South America. It's been estimated about 2/3 of the produce that we eat today has New World origins. So this greatly enriches the diets of Europeans. But the process tends to work to the disadvantage of native people, as not only invasive species like pigs, but also plants like wheat and barley and oats get planted in what had been, native woodlands or native farmlands. And you also have weeds, getting in the mix through things like animal feed, and they begin to displace native species. And in that way, they change the world that Indian foragers had adapted to over many centuries. And it becomes a new and in some ways unrecognizable place, places like New England, within a few decades. So all these changes are part of what Crosby calls ecological imperialism. Colonization involves not just people, but also animals, plants, diseases that can, upend native ways of life.
Right. Well, I could listen to you all day. I've learned a lot. I'm sure our teachers and students who are watching have. I'm sure they'll learn a lot from reading your essay and other essays in the textbook. Andrew Fisher of the College of William and Mary, I want to thank you so much for coming on to hold this conversation and for your contributions to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And all the teachers and students watching can register at billofrightsinstitute.org to have access to that free online textbook, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.